Everybody. I see we have some people from New Jersey, Long Island, Sullivan County, Brooklyn. We're very thankful to have all of you here today. We have with us Dr. Deborah Haskins, and she is going to be talking about mental health, ICU, or wellness. Are we putting our wellness ICU masks or daily practices in problem gambling, addictions, and mental health recovery? So Dr. Haskins, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Colleen, and thank you, New Jersey Council on Problem Gambling. Thank you, all of you who have chimed in. And I also see we have a board member from the Maryland Council Board, Dr. Chandra Parks from Maryland Council. I want to thank you all. I'm Dr. Deborah Haskins. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor, internationally certified gambling counselor. I do a lot of things. I'm also the president of the Maryland Council on Problem Gambling. And so I'm going to come to you and talk to you about a topic that I hope that all of us can benefit from. And I thought of this topic, and I'll tell you and explain why I came up with this title, Mental Health Wellness ICU. And a big part of that title is because I feel like as a human being, but also what I see in the work that I do as a professional counselor, as a gambling disorders leader, and clinician, as well as the work that we do here in our great state of Maryland and what you're doing in your great state of New York, that a lot of people are struggling to breathe. And so my question is, are we getting the mental health support that we need soon enough, or are we waiting until we're in an acute crisis where one would go to the ICU unit? All right, so we're going to get started. Last week we presented to the clinicians. Tonight we're hoping to help community members, and so hopefully you'll share this with the people you know. So at the end of tonight's presentation, hopefully you're going to be able to identify what are some of the risk factors that could influence this experience of being in an acute state in terms of mental health and well-being, where you're almost on life support or need life support. And we're going to talk about the risk factors with risky gambling, gaming, I should say, and addictions behavior. What I'm also hoping is to introduce a few instruments that you can use, and you can encourage the people that you support, yourself and others, to do some screenings of your own mental health well-being and how you cope. And I use the word consistently, because we're not talking about any one point in time and then picking it back up 3 years from now, but we're talking about learning how to assess our well-being regularly, every day, so that we don't end up in an acute crisis. And then I'm very practical oriented. When I'm working with my clients and community members, I'm always focusing on what resources can help support your well-being and where can you get help. I just got a call, for example, an hour ago from one of the pastors in the Baltimore, Washington United Methodist Church, who was calling for help because there was a congregational member who is breathing through being a victim of a workplace violent situation where there was a shooting, where this person was a victim. And then what happened today, this individual participated in treatment, therapeutic treatment for that acute traumatic experience and was doing better in well-being. But then today experienced another workplace violent situation where someone was shot, re-triggering well-being and mental health distress. And so just to tell you, like these experiences happen all the time. People can be in an acute situation when there's a crisis and need help right away. Or sometimes we are in these experiences that build up. So in this particular case, for example, real quickly, I was able to get the pastor connected to a therapist who actually was on her way to teach an evening class, but said, send me the person's phone number. I'm going to schedule a support session with this individual to give her a short session of support, at least tonight, when my class ends. So this is what happens when you go to the hospital. People show up every day in the hospital with acute symptoms, and they need oftentimes an acute response in an urgent emergency situation. We often experience similar challenges like the call for help that I got. And you are getting calls for help, or you may be a person who is breathing through your own challenges and need support. And so that's what we want to do. We want to help you be able to get the help sooner. All right, so what is well-being? Well-being means a lot of things. And if there's no one standard definition, if you look up the definition of well-being, according to the World Health Organization, they define well-being as a subjective experience. What that means is it depends on the person. Each person will have their own experience of what it feels well for them. Okay. And what we mean is like, how can you feel? What helps you to feel happy? What helps you to feel contentment? When do you feel like peace? And there are different parts of being well or content, or things feeling like I'm feeling like normal, or that things are okay. And so it could include relational well-being, like what are we thinking about in terms of the people that are in our lives? Who is in our village? Or do I have a sense of connection? Do I have involvement with other people? So for example, one gambler, when I asked this gambler who is now in recovery and treatment, who is there for you? Who are your friends? This particular Black male gambler said he had no friends. So that shows that there is a relational challenge in terms of well-being, because no man is an island. We can't breathe through life by ourselves on this island called life. Then we also have emotional well-being. And here we're talking about what makes you feel happy, as I said, contentment, what helps you to feel confident? Are you able to cope with life when things come your way? How resilient are you when facing challenges? So an example is I was listening to on the ESPN right before tonight's presentation, Serena Williams, who I love absolutely, the great Serena Williams, lost at Wimbledon. And when they asked her, how do you feel? Basically, they're asking her about her emotional well-being. What does it feel like today because you lost at Wimbledon? Are you going to come back? She says, I don't know. I can't predict what next year is going to be. So they said, well, what do you think? How are you feeling? And she says, I gave what I could. She says, all you can do is what you can do. So here's a person who, of course, she plays at a high level, and of course, she's filthy rich too, so she doesn't have to worry about losing. I have a niece who is a 3-time champion for WNBA, and she says that at the end of the day, she doesn't care if they win or lose because they're getting paid no matter what. That's different from the average citizen who isn't getting paid at that level. So their well-being might be more challenged. But still, I think there's a message in what Serena is saying is, I gave it what I could. And so what she's talking about is resiliency. And I'm going to get into some of those details tonight. But we also have spiritual well-being. What are we talking about with spiritual well-being? We're talking about, do you have a sense of purpose? Are you able to look at life in the universe and find meaning beyond, say, your job or the love relationships or the like relationships or the material resources that you have or don't have? Like there's a relationship that's transcendent between you and the universe. For some people, it's through a God of their understanding. That's a religious deity. It could be they're Muslim. It could be that they pray to Allah. They could be Buddhist. They could be they could be practicing indigenous health. They could be in a more, United States tends to be more dominantly Christian, but it could be in one of the Protestant, say, traditions, for example. But for some people who don't connect to a deity, it could be that they feel good being in nature when they're out in the world. They connect to the universe in that way. But we also have physical well-being, and we do see a link between people who have high-risk gambling behaviors as well as risky other types of behavioral addictions like substance use, drugs, alcohol, could be sexual addiction. It could be overeating and finding comfort in food. And so it can create those types of high risk behaviors can create chronic health conditions as well. We see that a lot of gamblers also show high percentages of chronic health conditions. And so we want to get to people earlier because we know that that's going to set us up for challenges. For example, Black men in particular die earlier from hypertension, heart disease, and then we also have chronic illnesses that also are rampant in the community with Black women, Black youth, for example, and other communities of color. And so, for example, when I go into the Latinx grocery stores, I'm looking at the sugar content with a lot of the processed food, which is a big problem for many of us. And what you see is high sugar content that's like 50 grams of sugar, when the average sugar gram should be less than 5 grams in any intake. And so what we're seeing is that people are addicted to sugar, and that's creating chronic health conditions. We're also talking about intellectual well-being. How do you feel good in your mind? Are you able to be creative if that's something that helps you be stimulated? Are you able to feel mentally stimulated? One of my gamblers who I provided therapy to, he was totally bored. And the reason why he started gambling as a Jewish man was he said he got tired of the boring furniture sales job, and the game got him excited. It helped him feel stimulated. And he said, I'm hoping that one day I'm going to hit the jackpot so I can leave this deadbeat job, punching in this deadbeat clock, and I can do the things that offer me stimulation and purpose. So these are just some of the pillars of well-being. I want you to be thinking about this as you start to assess your own self and what is giving you acute symptoms if you're in an acute state or you're showing some signs of distress. Okay, let me just briefly, I'm not going to click on this, but I want you to know that these are articles that you can Google and get access to. And I hope that the New York Council, will provide access to the slides. I don't know if this is going to be on their website, but Colleen can let us know. But this is an article that was published in the Los Angeles Times, and it talked about gambling addiction rising amid COVID pandemic. And so when the casinos were closed initially, people couldn't get to the physical venue. And so what do you think happened? They started buying more lottery tickets, and they started betting on sports really hugely. And so we now, because things have reopened, places have reopened, we're seeing that the numbers have skyrocketed for gambling. Sports betting is huge. Casino gambling, electronic machines, and online gambling is huge right now because it's accessible. People get access to it. It's socially acceptable because it's entertainment. And so people aren't going to look down at you if you are gambling, because they're not going to know that you're over gambling or excessively gambling. But if you are drinking, the signs of excessive drinking and excessive drug use is going to be noticeable pretty quickly, or excessive opiate use. So what we're also seeing is that esports is off the chains. So people are gambling on sports betting electronically, as well as placing bets in sports bars. I did a presentation on Sunday. I was telling Colleen about this for the country, my country of origin, which I just learned recently. I have about 50% Nigerian heritage, but they did a community wellness event on substance use, international substance use, and illicit trafficking. Awareness Day was Sunday. And so we were talking about gambling in Nigeria. And guess what? Gambling is off the charts in Nigeria. Primarily sports gambling is huge. And people are reporting that they're gambling more because it's quick money. And so anything that's going to get them quick money, They're using that because they need to take care of themselves and their family. These are some of the reasons why people are spending time on the games. And we're also seeing that a lot of women are gambling online with their devices. And we're seeing a relationship between levels of depression among women and gambling using your phone, just playing games, not even gambling, but playing games. And so playing games can also be a transition bridge to other risky behaviors like gambling. Not always for everybody, but we are starting to see some links between gaming as well as excessive gambling. And then I can't help but also share that opiate overdoses have skyrocketed, particularly among Black, Indigenous, and persons of color during the pandemic, although it is reducing among European descent and white persons during this pandemic time. And so the opiate crisis is an epidemic within the pandemic, it's being called. And so we've got to get to people earlier. You're hearing about, just over the last weekend, I'm a big NFL and NBA fan. And I don't know if any of you heard about this, but here in Baltimore, one of the 26-year-old Raven players died suddenly. As soon as I saw the news report, the first thing I thought, and I'm sure you can type into the chat if you wouldn't be surprised, I thought it was probably fentanyl, an unintentional overdose. And guess what? That's what happened. And so what we also want to understand, and I want you to type into the chat if you have any questions. We're going to take some time to check in with you about that. But COVID opened the doors to open the window, actually opened the curtains. One of my friends, who is Dr. Diane Reese, quoted this, and this comes from her. She said, COVID-19 opened the windows wide up. Hiding, because before COVID, we could hide not just behind the curtains, but behind the draperies to racial injustice and social injustice. So it's not even we were hiding behind the curtains, we were actually hiding behind draperies. You couldn't even see through the window at all. People pretended that social and racial injustice wasn't happening. And then what happened is things started to boil over because of the police brutality and all of the senseless murders of Black and brown persons around the country came to a boiling point, and people said, enough is enough, we're done, no more. And so now it was out in the open. And so we want to also pay attention to the reality that these racial experiences of injustice on a daily, insidious, regular basis creates ICU distress. And guess what? Do we understand why Black men and men of color die sooner? They die sooner because they also are experiencing distress related to racial injustice and social injustice, because Black men are feared in the world and people don't listen to them. Even little boys, when they're in school, guess what? Research shows that Black boys drop out psychologically in the 3rd grade. Why do they drop out psychologically that young? Guess why? Because they figure out by the 3rd grade that they're not visible. They raise their hands in the schools, and guess what? The teachers don't call on them. The teachers call on the non-white, the non-Black children first, European and whites, and then they may call on girls of color next. But boys of color are not seen even in the schools. So it's no surprise that they drop out at alarming rates, and they shut down, not just cognitively, but psychologically by the 3rd grade. That's unacceptable. So it's no surprise. Imagine growing up as a little boy, you go out into the world where the world doesn't count you, doesn't see you, doesn't validate your voice and want to see that you count. When you share that you're angry and that you're hurting, the world sees you as an angry, aggressive Black man or male of color. And what do? They fear you and they lock you up, or they tell you you can't express that. And so what do these Black and brown men do, they self-medicate. They start to hide. They start to pull in even more. All right, so that leads us up to what is the net result of all of this? The net outcome is that people are showing up in the intensive care unit. And the question is, why wait until we go to the ICU before getting help? Now, we know that there's lots of risk factors, but there are also some cultural reasons why people don't reach out for help early. But let's talk about what is needed. When you go into the hospital and you're in an urgent situation, what is the first question that they assess for? They check your vital signs. And so they're going to look to see what systems are in breakdown right now. And so one of the questions that I have for you, and we're going to take a poll, when was the last time you assessed your systems? I want you to think about your well-being, your emotional, your spiritual, your cognitive, intellectual, your physical, your financial. Look at all the different ways of well-being, and I want you to think about where are the areas that you're doing well, where are the areas that you're not doing well. And it may be that you're not doing well in any of those areas, which would mean if you went into an ICU, you would be in an acute state, you would be on the echo machine. That's full life support, lungs, heart, everything, okay? And so you're getting IVs to feed you. So I want you to be thinking about where are you right now? Because these are some of the risk factors. Some of the reasons why people delay or why people may be challenged or vulnerable is because of trauma, because of adverse childhood experiences, which include having a loved one in your home that is incarcerated, having someone in your home that has a mental health issue or a substance use issue, witnessing interpersonal violence, living in poverty, not having food or housing security, living in a community where there's great community adversity. These are a lot of the different adverse childhood experiences, but the one of the risk factors includes if we're ignoring some warning signals, because our body and our mind and our spirit sends us signals to say, okay, listen, you're not doing well. You're feeling like, I'll just say for myself, I can tell in my body when I'm starting to get close to a distress level. I start to feel internally like I'm about to close up. I feel like I can't breathe. So each of us have different systems, and our body will send little signals to say, okay, early alert, I want you to start paying attention. So for example, someone said to me recently, I just feel blah. I can't hardly get out of bed. I don't know why. There's no real reason that I can identify, but I'm just feeling kind of like this low level sadness. And I'm starting to be distracted. I'm finding that it's hard to complete certain tasks that I'm responsible for at work. That's a warning signal, okay? That's an early alert. And so one of the other risk factors includes that a person could have a lack of or non-access to what I consider, and my colleagues, healthy social supports. It's one thing to have social supports, and it's another thing to have healthy social supports. What do I mean by that? Not every person in our village is healthy. And so what I say to people is this: when you are an adult, you get to decide what healthy people get to stay in your environment. Some people you inherit your family, but you get to limit your access to them if they're triggering, if they're chaotic and confusion, and they don't provide the kind of peace and stability that you need for your own mental well-being. So I remember doing a presentation and someone said that she had a spouse who was not healthy, and it was creating a lot of distress. And so that means that you've got to make a decision, hopefully as a family. Are you going to get couples counseling, or are you going to go for individual counseling because that partner is not willing to get help? And so a good therapist can do couples work with even one partner. But the question is, what is your village of support? And is it a healthy village? And then we also know that there are problems in living that do require immediate and ongoing attention. And this is what can lead people to using drugs, selling drugs, because they don't have economic opportunities in their communities. And so they see the drug trade as the occupation that pays better. Gamblers will gamble because they feel like they know in their realistic mind that the world is maybe limited from their environment. They don't have access to lines of credit, et cetera, et cetera. And so they are trying to problem solve in the best way that they know how. And of course, we're trying to alert them that the game is designed for the house to win more and for the gamblers to lose more. All right. All right, so let's keep going. Now, these are some measures. I'm just going to click on one just so you can see this, and then I'll come back. This is an online stress test that I want you to see, and you can click on this when you get have an opportunity later, and it tells you answer yes or no. But look at the different reasons why a person could experience stress. Death of a spouse is considered to be one of the major mental health distress. Death of a close friend, also death of a child. Obviously, divorce, separation in terms of intimacy, marital reconciliation could also be stressful, because even though it's reconciliation, as my gambler, who was this Jewish male, he and his wife separated for 2 years. They reconnected. He said she asked him to promise that he would never gamble again. And guess what? He returned to gambling, I think probably because the reconciliation created new stress again for him. Marriage, gain of a family member, pregnancy, not being able to have pregnancy or fertility, being fired from your job, experiencing someone going to jail. So for example, I supported a family where the wife's husband was sent to prison while they were expecting their first child. And that is a very stressful situation. He was incarcerated for 4 years. And so that's highly stressful for any family unit. And also at a critical time, giving birth to a child alone, and then not having the partner to help you. So there are lots of different reasons why we could be in a situation that's stressful. I want you to think about that for yourself. So that's one measurement. I'm going to go back to our slide, okay? All right, let's get back. Stop share, new share. We're going to do a new share and get back here. All right, here we go again. Now, I'm not going to click these other ones on, but this is the third one is here for you all to Google when you get a chance to click it on. The next one is called a perceived stress scale. Basically, what it does, it asks you, what is your perception about your level of stress? Are you perceiving that you have stress in your environment? Are you do you perceive that, are you aware that you don't feel that you have the capabilities to problem solve the stress that you're encountering? All right. So these are just some tests that you can find online. The ACEs one, the reason why that's helpful is because it tells you that if you have a score of 4 out of 10 adverse childhood experiences, research documents that people usually show up with chronic future physical crises, like pulmonary breathing, respiratory disease, chronic illnesses, for example, hypertension, etc. Let me just stop and see if we have any questions or comments in the chat, and then we'll proceed after that. Okay, all right, so Colleen, I don't see anything.
No, just lots of like great points. Amazing.
Okay, great. Let's
yeah.
keep going. Okay, great. We're going to keep going, guys, because we got still some ground to cover. All right. Now, this is a really helpful diagram. Don't worry, if you were in school, it might create distress for you again, because you see these diagrams and you're like, oh my God, what is this? I'm going to walk you through it, but it's very helpful to understand it, because this is the stress and coping model. And I want you to think about it as you think about how you encounter stress, okay? So the stress and coping model says that typically there's a potential stressor. Stressor can be both positive and negative. So what happens when there's a stressor, the person then does an evaluation. There's a primary evaluation. The question is, what is the significance of this event? How does it affect my well-being? All right, so that's usually what we do, what's called primary appraisal or primary evaluation. We basically are kind of assessing to say, you know, what is the significance? Does this really matter? How does it affect my well-being? So an example is, I was at a family gathering on Sunday, a graduation celebration. And I was telling this, what I thought was a really fun early memory story. And my aunt called me yesterday and said, oh, you know, you shouldn't say certain things around so-and-so because she tends to embellish things. Now, so for me, that might have been a primary assessment for someone else to say, okay, I don't like that this family member could listen to what I shared and then repeat it and embellish it. But what I said to my auntie is, this isn't significant for me. This was a story from 35 years ago. I don't care. Okay? It's not important to me. Maybe this auntie was triggered because maybe she had a similar experience of a story she told and that person repeated it. And so her evaluation might have been different from mine. So I just wanted to use that as an illustration. There's usually some initial evaluation. What is the significance? And so the significance could be a number of things. It could be it's benign. It means it doesn't really, it's not important. It could be that it's a stressful event. It could be that it's an irrelevant event. All right. And so for me, like I said, in that example, it was irrelevant. I just forgot about it. But for some people, say it was a stressful event. Say in the case of the woman who called for help today. Now, that might not be the best situation, but I still want to use it because here is a person who has experienced workplace trauma that is also stress. Trauma is stressful. Any type of trauma introduces stress, okay? And the person has to make a decision, how am I going to breathe through this traumatic event that has now introduced stress in my being? And so she reached out for help because in terms of the appraisal, what is the significance of the event? For her, it's a stressful event because now she sees a threat. She also has an injury and it's also a challenge. So it could be several things going on at the same time. It may not be one or the other. And so what we then tend to see is then there's a secondary evaluation. Then the person is going to then say, well, what can I do about it? What will it cost? What result do I expect? Fortunately for this woman, because she had been in therapy before, trauma services, she called her pastor, who is her support village, part of her support village. Her pastor called me to say, listen, I remember you gave me a list of culturally diverse therapists in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, throughout the state of Maryland. I don't have my list on me right now because this church member called me. I'm calling you for help. Can you give me a referral? And so the response is, what can I do? In her case, she's going to go into therapy again. So the person is going to do some assessment, usually, of what are their personal coping resources. For a lot of people, they know realistically they don't have the resources. So what we tend to understand about people who are largely depressed, guess what? People who are depressed are the most realistic people in the world. Why? Because they know what they can and can't do. A person who's not depressed tends to be really idealistic and have this great vision where things can, they think the sky's the limit. But a person who's depressed knows, I can't do this. As one of my clients said, Dr. Haskins, this is too hard. And guess what? I didn't fully understand what my client was trying to convey. I was like the cheerleader counselor, rah, rah, of course you can do this. Hang in there, until I also experienced my own experiences of homicidal injury. And now I understand what it can feel like when your heart is ripped out of your body. When people say that they can't do it in this secondary evaluation, we need to pay attention to them. We've got to give them the resources to help them. And that's why I'm glad that the New York Council and councils around the United States, many of us are doing more community wellness to try to take the information to the streets to say, okay, if this is happening, do this, do that, call here for help, text for help. You can text for help. You don't even have to talk out loud if you're concerned that the people in your environment are going to listen and hear what you're saying. You can even text and get help. So the response to the secondary evaluation tends to be either, what are some of the coping outcomes that a person could choose? Some people can, there are two ways of coping. You can have emotion-focused coping. So the person called for help today is choosing an emotion-focused coping. She needs to be in acute trauma services, all right, to support her breathing. Got a link to a therapist. She doesn't have to show up in the emergency room. The therapist was on her way to the class, is going to schedule a mini session tonight after class. And guess what? Class ends at 10 o'clock in this particular person's case. And she's willing to provide that level of acute response right away, because this is an emergency. All right. Another coping strategy could be the person is focused on the problem, where they need problem solving. And so then you have the result. And the question is it working? Is the stress moving? Is it getting supported? Is it increasing? Because sometimes a person is accessing resources in their love or like village that is not equipped to help them in the way that they can, that they need help the most. So maybe in this case today, a person would say, well, you already went to therapy. Of course you can get through this. God is your helper. God is your savior. He's with you. You can, just remember what you learned the last time you were in therapy. Guess what? That's not working for her right now. And so there needs to be an evaluation and a reevaluation to say, okay, what is it that's going to help the person feel better? Let me give you another example, because this is a journey that there's no one straight line. It goes up and down. It's almost like you're on a roller coaster sometimes with your mental health well-being. And so my invitation to all of us tonight is that we're on this journey. Be willing to know that you're going to go up sometimes and your well-being is going to be up. Sometimes it's going to plateau out and level out. Sometimes you're going to feel down. But hopefully you're going to have the resources that you know what to access and to know what is needed for different types of stress. All right. So the step one, I'm going to give you 3 steps, okay? And the first step, which comes out of this really good book that talks about evidence-based strategies, it talks about check your passive coping. A lot of times what we're doing as a stress coping, whether it's a problem coping strategy or an emotion coping strategy, sometimes we're using what's called passive coping. And what is a passive coping? Passive coping are strategies that are inactive tactics employed to avoid a disagreement or some type of conflict among people or institutions. They tend to be strategies such as, I'm going to go into denial. I'm going to pretend that this isn't really happening, because maybe the person is alert that they don't have the capability internally and externally, or internally they may not have the capability and they have external resources, but they don't feel like it's enough, it's not sufficient. And so denial may be a way for them to pretend this isn't happening, or to avoid the stress, or to minimize the stress. Now, let me just say this about denial. Denial is a defense mechanism that has an unconscious influence. And that's the unconscious mind saying, okay, ready to go on shutdown. This is too much. You can't handle it. I need to block this. All right. So there's not anything necessarily that's bad about some denial. The question is if we're engaging in this tactic of passive coping to the extreme where we're not able to function when other stress happens in our life. All right. Also, being mentally disengaged, where a person can shut down. Now, this is what happens when a person is drinking, using drugs, opiates, and even gambling, or even emotionally coping by overeating, or as someone I know who was a hoarder because her father had been killed and became a hoarder. And so mental disengagement and behavioral disengagement. So these passive coping strategies, if they're used to an extreme, don't work over time. All right. And so again, I've already talked about self-medicating, and why is passive coping important to look at? Because obviously we cannot self-medicate forever. There's going to come a point in time when we have to be in reality and face the music, or look at life and step up and deal with some of the things that life is handing our way. So this is an activity that I want you to think about, and I encourage you and invite you to participate in this exercise more after tonight's Facebook Live event. I want you to recall a stressful event that required you to do some venting, like a stress event that happened. I want you to think about, what was your behavior like around the person or situation that caused the venting? And then I want you to think about and assess or evaluate, in your opinion, was the venting useful? Yes or no? And so, Colleen, let's see if anybody can type into the chat, if they are typing into the chat any responses. And so what I want you to be thinking about, and this didn't number correctly, you know, sometimes we're venting by using blame language, like it's your fault, if you did this better, if you showed up better in my relationship, if the managers would recognize me, and that's probably some truth to it. But let me tell you a really funny story. One time I worked at a job and I was feeling like I wasn't really appreciated. And so I moved to another organization, and at my outgoing event, they had a big reception for me. And I thought, finally, I'm getting recognized, because I would vent a lot about not being appreciated. And I thought, I'm going to finally get some gifts at this going away event. And at this event, the big leader was so excited and gave me this little box. And I opened the box and she said, you're going to be so excited about this. I thought of you when I saw this. And I opened it, and it was a little crab, a Merlin crab. And I was very disappointed, because I thought, oh my goodness, is that it? Is that all? I thought I was going to get a bonus check, some type of like going away gift that I would be able to go on a nice little vacation. Again, does the venting help or not? Because even as I was exiting, it taught me a lesson. Don't expect others to show you appreciation. Is that something that you can pull from within better? Because guess what? Even when you left, all you got was a little Merlin crab. You know, I didn't even get, like, give me a dozen crabs that I can eat and enjoy. Okay. Anyway, But how successful was your attempt to reduce the blame language? And did you feel that you cope better by being able to manage your reactions if you try something different? So I want you to try to alter the venting and alter using blame language. Because venting without using blame language, what the research shows is that venting does help reduce the anger. But what happens is over time, if all you're doing as your stress coping strategy is venting, it doesn't help you over the long run. It actually makes you more enraged. Okay? So let me just show you a quick illustration. This is really funny because you all in New York, and I'm a big NBA fan, but this is Stephen Smith and the New York Knicks, and he's venting about, you've probably already seen it and read it. So let me just pause the share and do a new share because sometimes I forget about this. All right. All right, we got it. Let's see. Let's listen to Stephen Smith.
Dr. Haskin, we can only see your slide that has the link on it right now.
Okay, so hold on. Let me stop share. All right, so I stop share. Do share.
Yep, should be able to share new and then share whatever link you just opened up.
All right.
This is your New York Minute. Everybody say Brooklyn.
Can you hear it?
It was a show
Yes, we can hear it.
last night as the Nets beat the Knicks in overtime, 111-106, down their big three, down 28 points, including 16 in the fourth. The Nets found a way to steal a W. Julius Randle's 31 points wasn't enough as the Knicks have now lost 3 straight heading into All-Star weekend, and the Nets play the Wizards tonight at 7:30 p.m. The Islanders faced off against the Boston Bruins tonight at UBS Arena.
No, this isn't the
Isles
one.
looked to
This
snap
is,
a 3-game
I wanted you
losing
guys
streak
to
where
see
they've been
Stephen
outscored
Smith, so
14-6. Puck
it's
drop
not
is
coming
at
on.
7:30 p.m.
For whatever
And the
reason.
red
We
hot
can try
Rangers-
to, I can, if we find the link, I can make sure we put it in the chat and we'll make
All
sure
right.
everybody gets it.
All right, we'll just stop the share. All right.
We do have a hand up. Deborah has a hand up, and then there's just a couple of comments in the chat. Just about Benjamin said, personally, I isolate and engulf myself into creative arts. Venus said, my venting didn't help, it helped temporarily.
Okay.
Yeah, another person that said venting didn't help, avoid venting until they can express my thoughts and feelings properly.
I need to pause just for a minute. I'm sorry. Can you guys hear that?
No.
Okay. Let me just cut this off because I heard you, but for some reason it's still playing. Hold on. Okay. All right, I got it. So now we're back. Go ahead. Can you restate that again? I apologize.
So no worries. And just so you know, you're not sharing your screen yet. So
Okay.
we do have a hand up. I don't know if you want to take that question or wait until
No, go right ahead.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think you had
Deborah?
a question. Yeah. You were asking
No.
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Sullivan. I did it wrong. I was trying to let you know I had been here from the start of the meeting. Disregard that.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Thanks for being here
All right.
tonight. Okay, so
Yes,
let me
you
just
too.
pick up. If you get to see that clip, basically what you would see is Stephen A is going off. He's venting. He's so upset. He's saying that I am not going to another Knicks game. And he is, you could see that if you took his blood pressure, he was probably off the charts with his blood pressure, and his colleagues are trying to calm him down. But venting, as I said, can reduce acute frustration in the moment, but it doesn't help over time. And so what we want to use instead is try to reframe what's happening. Because if we don't have any control over some of these situations that we don't have control over, say in the case of Serena Williams, what she did was a reframe. She says, I gave what I could. They said they were talking about her losing. She says, all you can do is what you can do. So in effect, what Serena is doing is, instead of venting about what she didn't do and criticizing herself, and she's probably going to review the tape and the film, but what she's doing is using reframing statements to increase her self-awareness that will help her emotional well-being. Because it's only so much that you can vent before it starts to create, it's going to create even more distress. The other important assessment is to make sure that we're understanding what type of stress we're dealing with, because we have low level stress, we have high level stress, we have acute stress, short-term stress that may need something initial and quick, but then we can have chronic or recurrent stress, which is long-term. And so what happens oftentimes is that if a person is not getting the right kinds of support, or they don't have the necessary coping strategies to employ to deal with some of those low-level stress, as well as some of the high-level stress, what can happen is things become cumulative, and then things start to store up. And you have a warehouse of emotions that at a certain point, you can't store it but so long. Think about if you get a storage unit, you can't put everything in it. You're going to have to increase the space. So that's the same idea if you think about your emotional storage. At a certain point, the brain starts to shut down and says signals like, I can't do this. This is too much. I'm overwhelmed. I can't handle this. And when it's chronic and recurrent stress, then a person is going to need ideally multiple types of interventions. And this is what we call recovery-oriented systems of care in many cases, because you may need to deal with the unemployment issue. You've got to get unemployment and workforce development support. You have the emotional support. You may need to see a doctor. You may need to access this type of support, the credit counseling support. If you're a gambler, you have different levels of system support to deal with the various types of stressors, okay? So what we want, in effect, we want people to learn how to engage in more active coping and what we call adaptive behavior strategies. And these are focused ways to problem solve and get support, particularly by healthy support systems, okay? Because these are the resources that help build resiliency. And so the question is, we have this new concept called positive psychology. And what positive psychology recognizes is that many of us have been breathing through stress our entire lives. We come from families where we have intergenerational traumas, and we have resiliencies as communities of color, for example. And so we have breathed through multiple stresses, but it still has come at a cost for our physical well-being and our mental well-being. And so the question is, are we able to stand even when we get knocked down? What helps a person to remain standing even in the face of hardship and maybe even challenging times like acute stressors? All right. So what we also want you to do then is to start to adopt and substitute some cognitions that can be more flexible. Like anybody that uses woulda, shoulda, coulda, that tends to be inflexible cognitions that don't help us. But being, identifying more substitute, like I said, the Serena one, or we can say with gamblers, this isn't a cure. We know step one is I'm taking a step 1 minute, 1 second, 1 hour, 1 day. Okay. And I see, remember that diagram you saw where there's a journey? I'm on a journey. Sometimes I'm going to go up. Sometimes I'm going to come down. Sometimes I'm going to be on level ground. Sometimes I'm not going to feel like I'm on the ground at all. All right. But I'm still here trying to breathe. All right. And so this was one of the polls that I wanted to take. Are you using the right type of strategy for the type of stressor that you're facing? Okay. So I know that's going to lead us to Colleen. I want to check in and see if people have any questions. Also, before we wrap up, and then we also have some resources for you. So do we have time to do that?
Yeah, we have a few minutes left.
Okay.
Benjamin put a question in the chat.
Okay. Thank
What
you, Benjamin.
I don't know, what does she think of untraditional interventions that may not be evidence-based?
And thank you, Benjamin, for asking. I think that that's definitely worthy to explore. One of the challenges that we have, there's so much reliance on EBTs, but what we know is that EBTs are not culturally inclusive, and they tend to have used mostly European, clinical trials. And so what it means is that we don't know that it's representative as an effective strategy with particular cultural communities. And we know that many cultural communities have coping strategies that have worked for them since the beginning of time. And because they have not been researched, they don't get voice. But we have to give validation to these and use them, because these are what we call indigenous practices oftentimes that matter. And so I would definitely encourage us to use those cultural resources that seem to be working for folks. Like I tell, some of you might have been, I know I have someone who was on the call last week, but I love, this is Dr. Haskins' quote: "People are doing their own group therapy in their own communities. They're not coming to see us clinicians, because guess what? What they're doing works for them. They sit on their porch, they're talking to their barber, they're talking to their hairstylist, they're seeing their doctor, they're talking to their coworker, they're using ancient healing practices, spiritual practices, herbal medicine, nature-informed practices that work for them." And so I would encourage you to definitely use that, document that if you are a clinician, but if you are just a regular person, like a human being breathing and it's working for you, then use it. Like, if it works, keep doing it, keep doing more of it. If it's not creating harm to yourself and others, then it must have some validity. And so we definitely know that, unfortunately, indigenous practices aren't getting the recognition as it should and deserve. Okay. So you want to go ahead? I don't know if we have time to do the poll, Colleen. Do we?
We have about 2 minutes. So up to you if you want to.
Well, let me just, just because of time, just self-assess for yourself.
Okay.
Hopefully what you're doing is this talk will help you do this self-assessment, and then check your self-care. These other slides just shows you basically what I summarized. They're different levels of self-care intervention. Look and see, what do you need? If you haven't attended to your physical well-being, make an appointment with your doctor. Get a checkup and see what's going on. Because particularly men of color tend to show up when they're in full crisis ICU. And by that time, it's really severe. And that also includes people of color showing up for treatment. They're usually at such severe mental health distress that things become more complicated. So these are just some, resources that will encourage you to, look for how to pay attention to yourself, talk to your love and like village, recognize that well-being is personal. What feels right to you may not be the same for someone else. And then I encourage you to call for help in New York. If you go to the New York Problem Gambling website, they will link you to services in your region. We also have an All In the Addicted Gamblers podcast. There are a lot of self-management resources that people can use. And then you also have literature. And then this is a good book that talks about behavioral addictions. And I'm a big fan of self-management resources, bibliotherapy. And then if we had time, I was going to play the song. And so I'm just going to play it anyway, and we'll roll out with this. I love this song by Sounds of Blackness. And do we have time to do that, Colleen?
Yeah, we absolutely can. If I can just real quick, just let everyone know that this video will be available on our Facebook page. So if anyone wants to view it again, share it, feel free, and we'll absolutely get the slides out to everyone. I'll talk to Dr. Haskins and we can make sure that you have all those resources. But go ahead, take it away.
Okay, I think this is the one. I hope I'm right. Okay. All right, so this is the one that talks about the jelly bean. And this is not the one that I really wanted, but this was an exercise that I was going to click on. Nothing seems to be going well for me today, but it's all good. If you get a chance, because we're out of time, Google Change by Sounds of Blackness. It's a great song that will encourage your heart, your spirit, and it talks about, you know, change. All we have to do is believe that there can be change, you know, and the Sounds of Blackness do a great job singing it. So that would have been the time rollout. This is the wrong videotape. I'm sorry. All right, that's it, everybody. And feel free, if you're looking for other resources, Colleen and the New York Council is available. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on my email address, hello@drdeborahhaskins.com, and I'll get you directed to resources.
Thank you all so much, Dr. Haskins. Thank you.
You're
We
welcome.
appreciate your time, and everyone have a great evening.
All right, bye-bye. Thanks, Colleen.